There is a pair of shoes somewhere in a house in Manila that nobody has thrown away, and if you want to understand why a 21-year-old collapsed onto the grass of center court and could not speak, you have to start there instead of on the tennis court, because the tennis court is only where the story finished, not where it began. The shoes light up when you step on them, or they used to, before the batteries died years ago and nobody bothered to replace them, because by then the girl who wore them had grown out of needing lights to know where she was going. Alongside them, folded into the same forgotten corner of a closet, sit a pair of socks with ruffles that no longer fit anyone. Socks a small girl wore on afternoons after school when she would run onto a club court chasing a brother who was faster than her and a grandfather whose approval felt like the only thing worth chasing at all. That girl's name is Alex Eala, and on the 4th of July, 2026, in front of a crowd that simply would not sit back down, she stepped into a forehand, watched it land in the corner, dropped her racket to the grass, and folded to her knees before her body had even finished falling, sobbing on the most famous patch of turf in the sport, and an entire country on the other side of the world sobbed right along with her. Because for the first time in the history of tennis, a Filipino had beaten a defending Wimbledon champion, and everyone watching understood, without needing it explained, that this was never really about one match. To feel the size of what just happened, you need two facts sitting side by side in your head at the same time. The first is almost embarrassing to say out loud, because it makes what came next look impossible. Eala arrived at this Wimbledon having won exactly one match in 5 previous appearances at Grand Slam tournaments, a record so thin it barely counts as a resume, the kind of number that gets attached to a player's name by commentators trying to be polite about a talented kid who has not yet figured out how to win when it matters most. The second fact is the identity of the woman standing across the net from her that afternoon, Iga Swiatek, the reigning Wimbledon champion, the world number 3, a 6-time Grand Slam winner with a resume so decorated it barely needs an introduction anymore. On paper, this was not a contest, it was a mismatch dressed up as a match, ranking number 32 against ranking number 3, a player who had beaten Swiatek exactly once in her career, 16 months earlier in Miami, in a result the tennis press quietly filed away as a nice story about a wild card catching a superstar on an off day rather than the start of anything. Since that afternoon in Miami, Swiatek had gone on to win Wimbledon. Since that afternoon in Miami, Eala had built a career that read, from a distance, like unfinished business, a runner-up finish at Eastbourne on the grass, 2 WTA 125 titles including one in Birmingham just weeks before this tournament, a career-high ranking of 29 back in March, all of it impressive. None of it translating into results at the tournaments that actually define how history remembers a tennis player. At the majors, she was still, statistically speaking, a beginner. That is the tension you could see from the outside, the numbers on a scoreboard. What almost nobody outside a handful of coaching boxes understood was the tension underneath it, the part that had nothing to do with rankings at all, because for Eala, walking onto center court against the defending champion was never simply an athletic assignment, it was something closer to a personal reckoning, a girl who once wore ruffled socks and light-up sneakers being asked, in front of the entire tennis world, whether she actually belonged in a room her country had never once occupied. Keep that in mind, because it explains everything that happened once the match actually started, and it explains why, when it ended, the tears on her face did not look like the tears of someone who had simply won a. Needed more of what Eala was doing was not a small gesture, it was, in the most literal sense possible, an older icon extending a hand to a new one, and the country took it without hesitation, because reporters covering the run afterward described something close to a cultural handoff taking place in real time. The Sunday mornings that used to belong to Pacquiao's fights giving way to weeknight evenings spent glued to a tennis broadcast instead, the same collective anticipation simply relocated to a different arena entirely. Consider the scale of what that actually means. The Philippines is a nation of roughly 117 million people scattered across more than 7,000 islands, with one of the largest diasporas anywhere on Earth, and before this fortnight, in the entire history of the sports open era, dating back to 1968, no Filipino man or woman had ever won a main draw singles match at Wimbledon. Eala did not just break that drought, she shattered it, winning 3 matches at this tournament alone, becoming the first Filipina to reach the 3rd round of any Grand Slam and then, almost immediately, the first to reach the tennis match. They looked like the tears of someone who had finally been let in. The first set alone stretched past 80 minutes, an eternity by the standards of a 2-set format, and it played out less like a tennis match and more like a heavyweight bout where neither fighter would go down for good. Swiatek struck first, ripping a forehand pass down the line to break for a 2-1 lead, the kind of shot that tells an opponent exactly who is in charge. Eala answered immediately, and the way she answered mattered, because it revealed just how deeply she had studied her opponent, floating a high, looping return that dragged Swiatek out of her rhythm, then following it with a sharply angled pass off a Swiatek drive volley to level the set right back up. The two of them traded games until Eala broke again to lead 5-3, stepping to the baseline with a set point in her pocket, only to watch Swiatek do exactly what defending champions are supposed to do in that moment: rip off 3 consecutive forehand winners to save it, then hold to pull the set level at 5 apiece. Historically, that kind of escape crushes the spirit of a lower-ranked opponent. It is the sort of comeback that turns matches into formalities. Eala simply did not break. The set went to a tiebreak, and it is here, in a stretch of points most casual viewers would have scrolled past, that the entire match quietly tilted on its axis, because Eala's serve, the one weapon every scouting report for 2 years had circled as her obvious weakness, kept dying at Swiatek's feet, refusing to arrive with any pace at all, and somehow that refusal was the problem. Swiatek would later admit, without hedging, without excuses, that the slow serve had been surprisingly difficult to time, that the slower it got, the harder it became to read, an admission worth sitting with for a moment, because this is a 6-time major champion, in the raw aftermath of a loss, publicly conceding that a stylistic quirk had unraveled her. The tiebreak swung wildly, Eala building a lead, Swiatek clawing back to set point, Eala saving it with an unreturned serve, saving a second when Swiatek's forehand caught the net, and finally, on her 4th set point of the breaker, watching Swiatek's forehand sail long to hand her the set. Something shifted in Eala's body after that point, something you could see rather than measure, because the second set became the kind of tennis coaches will be pulling up on film for years to study. She broke to open it. She held to love behind a pair of aces. The very serve everyone insisted was a liability, now producing free points against a former world #1. She broke again to go up 3-love, and by the time she sat down for the changeover leading 4-love against the defending Wimbledon champion, she was not the underdog anymore in any meaningful sense. She was simply the better player on the court, full stop, no qualifiers attached. Swiatek clawed one break back to make it 4-2, refusing to disappear quietly, and then came the final game, a game that needed 6 deuces and 4 saved breakpoints before it would end, a stretch of tennis that stopped being about tactics or technique and became, instead, about what happens when a person arrives somewhere she never quite let herself believe she deserved to stand, and then has to survive just long enough to actually feel it. Swiatek produced a backhand winner that will be remembered as one of the finest shots of her tournament to save a first match point. But on the 3rd match point, serving herself, Eala stepped into a forehand and drove her 24th winner of the afternoon into the corner, and when the ball landed, the whole stadium seemed to inhale in unison before the sound came crashing down. The final numbers, if you care about numbers, tell a story of genuine dominance rather than luck. 24 winners against 21 unforced errors for Eala, 32 winners but 44 unforced errors for Swiatek, 5 of 7 breakpoints converted, 8 of 11 saved, 55% of second serve points won against Swiatek's 32. The kind of statistical profile that belongs to a player who studied a champion in detail and out-executed her on the biggest stage the sport offers. But numbers are not what a nation of 117 million people carries home with them. What they carry home is the 60 seconds that followed. Because when the last point ended, Eala did not celebrate the way players usually do. She dropped her racket to the grass, brought both hands to her face, and sank to her knees, and when the on-court microphone reached her, still visibly shaking, she said something that would end up replaying in living rooms across an entire archipelago, telling the crowd, through tears, that for someone like her opponent who had won so many Grand Slams, or for legends like Serena or Venus Williams, a moment like this might look small, but for a girl who grew up in the Philippines training after school with her brother and her grandfather, wearing ruffled socks and light-up shoes with chubby cheeks, this was everything. And then, almost as an afterthought, catching her breath before the applause could swallow her completely, she added that being emotional did not mean she was satisfied, so the next round, let's go. To understand exactly why that sentence detonated the way it did across the Philippines, you have to meet the man she calls Lolo Bob, Lolo being the Filipino word for grandfather, because he is, by her own account, the reason she picked up a racket at all. He was never a professional coach, just a club-level player who loved the game enough to read about it obsessively, to sit through hours of matches on television, and to pass all of it down to his grandchildren the way some grandfathers pass down fishing or gardening, coaching her mother in swimming years earlier, coaching her brother and cousins in tennis, and eventually introducing Alex to a sport that became less about competition and more about a routine 2 people could share on an ordinary weekday afternoon. She has said, in interviews since, that every time she accomplishes something important, he is the first person she thinks about, the man who worked so hard and sacrificed so much just so she could have the opportunity to try. So when she stood on center court and named her brother and her grandfather in front of a global television audience, she was not reaching for a soundbite. She was publicly crediting the two people who quietly built the version of her capable of standing there at all. The tennis world responded to the moment with a kind of honesty that champions rarely offer in defeat, because in her own press conference afterward, Swiatek admitted flatly that she needed to rebuild her game from the ground up, that she was simply not on the level she needed to be, an admission that carried real weight given how rarely a player of her stature concedes that much territory to an opponent, let alone does it without a single caveat attached. And it was not only tennis players paying attention. Months earlier, back in February, Manny Pacquiao, the greatest athlete the Philippines has ever produced, an 8-division world boxing champion whose fights once emptied entire city streets, had gone on Philippine television to say how proud Eala made him, that she carried the flag of the country everywhere she competed, and that the nation needed more athletes exactly like her, urging her simply to keep working hard. For a generation of Filipinos who grew up organizing their Sunday mornings around a Pacquiao broadcast, hearing the man himself say the country's second week of one, all while holding a career-high ranking that already made her the highest-ranked Filipino of any gender in the history of the WTA. It is almost strange, when you say it out loud, that the emotional space Pacquiao once occupied by himself, a role no other Filipino athlete has convincingly filled in a decade, now belongs, at least in part, to a 5'8" left-handed player from Quezon City who came up on scholarship through the Rafael Nadal Academy in Spain. There are moments in a country's sporting history when a single result stops being about the sport entirely and becomes something closer to a shared cultural memory, and this was clearly one of them, which makes it easy to forget just how close Eala came to never reaching that court at all, because 48 hours earlier, in the second round, she had been in real danger against Australia's Maya Joint, a player who had already beaten her once that same season. Eala dropped the first set 6-3, and for stretches of that opening set she looked exactly like the player her skeptics had spent 2 years describing, talented but fragile on the biggest stages, not quite ready for the moment. She then reversed the match completely, winning the next 2 sets 6-2 and 6-love in a performance ESPN described as something close to a measure of revenge. Hold those two moments in your head at the same time, because the distance between them is not really about talent. She has always had plenty of that. The distance is about the willingness to walk back onto a court after losing the first set of a match she had already lost to that same opponent once before, and then to do it all over again 2 days later against someone infinitely more famous. That is not a fairy tale unfolding by accident. That is a professional executing a plan under pressure and refusing to blink. So return, for a moment, to the shoebox, to the light-up shoes with the dead batteries, to the ruffled socks that fit no one anymore, because somewhere in a house in Manila, they almost certainly still exist, tucked away in a drawer a mother could never quite bring herself to empty, because parents rarely throw out the shoes that belong to a child who grew up to matter this much. The girl who wore those shoes ran onto a club court every single afternoon to spend time with a grandfather she called Lolo Bob, for the same simple reason children everywhere pick up a bat or a ball or a racket in the first place, because someone they loved was standing on the other side, and being near them was worth chasing. 15 years later, on the 4th of July, 2026, on center court at Wimbledon, that exact same swing produced the 24th winner of a match against the reigning champion of the tournament, and the woman who hit it sank to her knees and wept. It is, in every way that matters, the same swing, and the same person underneath it. What has changed is only the size of the room she is now standing inside. Swiatek said she needed to work from the beginning, and she meant it purely about her own game, but the phrase works just as well as a description of what Eala has just done to an entire nation's relationship with sport, because she has made a country of 117 million people want to start from the beginning right alongside her, to learn her story from the very first swing, to understand exactly what those ruffled socks and light-up shoes meant before they ever meant anything to the rest of the world.